Hello and welcome to Global Data Thematic Intelligence. Our team tracks over 100 tech, industry, ESG and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm Kris. Today I'll be talking to Tim Durrant, who is a program director at UK think tank, the Institute for Government, about how messaging platforms such as WhatsApp are impacting governance and the importance of record keeping in a digital age. Hi, Tim. How are you doing today?
Hi, Kris. I'm really well. It's great to be here.
Great. We're excited to have you on the podcast today. There's been a recent focus on the use of WhatsApp in government and how it affects the ability to keep records for historical purposes. In March, the Scottish Government announced more details of a review to determine if WhatsApp and other messaging apps should be used for government businesses. So how has the use of messaging platforms like WhatsApp changed how ministers are communicating?
I think it's really interesting to think about this kind of in historical context because the last few years has been all about WhatsApp, and that's been particularly exacerbated by the COVID inquiries that have been happening in the UK and looking at how ministers in the UK level, but also Scottish Government ministers, Welsh Government ministers used WhatsApp. But it's kind of the latest version of technological change that has changed government quite fundamentally. So I remember people talking about when New Labour came into government in the mid-90s, and ministers then were texting each other, which wasn't something that had ever happened before. And so there's always been this kind of government catching up with the latest technology. I think what is particular about WhatsApp is it's so fast, it's so ubiquitous, it's kind of very easy to use. And, it's not just used in government, right? It's used everywhere. Everybody uses WhatsApp for their personal discussions as well as for work discussions. And so in a way, government is just kind of following what everyone else is doing. And therefore, we don't think WhatsApp and use of WhatsApp in government is a bad thing in and of itself. I think what it raises, because it brings lots of benefits, what it raises, though, are sort of questions about how do you manage when so much communication is quite informal, quite quick, and not on the sort of official government channels. And it raises sort of two sets of questions. One is about long-term kind of transparency and record keeping. So historically, government papers have been made public after 20 or 30 years, and people can see kind of what individual ministers thought about particular things because of what they wrote down on bits of paper or what their offices wrote down about their opinions on things. But if all of that is contained in WhatsApp messages, will that actually be recorded? Because if it's on that person's individual phone, will it even make it into the government official kind of records is unclear. So there's that kind of longer term point. But there's also, and this is where the COVID inquiries have been really interesting, there's the kind of question about decision making in the moment. And WhatsApp is great in many ways, but it doesn't allow sort of in-depth, considered discussions. What it's about is quick messages, relaying little bits of information. And also when there's a big group of people, it can be quite sort of overwhelming. I'm sure everyone's been in one of those sort of group chats where there's 20 or 30 people and you've just got messages pinging all the time and you can't follow the whole conversation. And I think that use of communication isn't helpful in government when you're making big, serious decisions that need analysis and evidence and different bits of advice and different points of view considered. And so we think there's a risk, and it's not clear how much it is being used for that kind of decision making, but we think there's a risk that it pulls ministers away from sort of best practice when it comes to decision making.
Focusing in on the COVID-19 pandemic and sort of what came out of that, how did that highlight the issues in the use of the platform, or were there any specific circumstances that you can point to that really highlight the issues?
I think part of it is because it was already there. WhatsApp already existed pre-COVID, but because people weren't physically together, because people were working from home, everyone was in lockdown. WhatsApp was just an easier way of communicating. The other thing about government tech in particular is that in the UK, government departments are all on their own IT systems. And some use Microsoft Teams, some use Google Chats, and there's no sort of one common platform that can be used across every government department for kind of informal messaging. Obviously, they can email each other, but there's no sort of one common platform. And so WhatsApp became that kind of way of doing it because, all you need is someone's phone number, you can just add them in. And it was an easy way of bringing together groups of politicians, their advisors, but also civil servants and kind of setting up those cross-government conversations, which were really important during the pandemic because it was such a kind of cross-cutting issue that affected every bit of government.
Overall, what would you define as the key risks of widespread use of WhatsApp in government?
I mean, I think it's the 2 points made earlier, I guess. I think, there's one is about record keeping and transparency, and whether or not information that should be kept and potentially made public in due course is actually able to be kept because it's on people's personal devices or it's in these chats. And that's why we've said that if people are going to use WhatsApp, then it should be on government issued phones rather than their personal phones, because for government business, not for everything, but then it's not their responsibility to ensure that it's kept once they leave government. So, we've seen during the COVID inquiry, again, Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson haven't been able to provide the WhatsApps from their phones. If those were government phones, they could be kept by their government IT people and provided to inquiries as needed. But also, like with emails and memos and other documents, they could be stored ready for release in 20 or 30 years' time. And then the other thing is, the sort of the speed of the communication that WhatsApp delivers is useful in certain ways. But as I said, it doesn't allow for detailed discussion. And we've spoken to various people who also made the point that, it can be quite almost a competitive way of communicating. If you're sort of in a group where lots of stuff is happening, you want to show off, you want to kind of sound clever, you want to show that you know what's going on, but that doesn't lend itself to proper in-depth discussion and consideration of analysis. So I think there's a risk that decision-making processes aren't the best way of doing things if everyone is just relying on what people are telling them on WhatsApp.
Yeah, sort of risk of incomplete information and things like that.
Exactly.
And then, so other than the sort of personal phones that you recommend in the report, what other recommendations does the Institute make for mitigating the risks, and sort of why should these be pursued over an outright ban?
So we think not using personal phones for government business. We think making sure that where things are on WhatsApp that need to be kept, there's a way of getting that information onto kind of official government files. And to give credit to the government, they've also said this. So there was some guidance from the Cabinet Office, the kind of central department in the government, that recommended that where people are using WhatsApp, they should make sure that if it's relevant, those conversations can be copied across onto other file structures or file formats so that it can be preserved. And we think that's key. And we also think, WhatsApp should be used for what it's good for rather than for everything. So a lot of the time, it is just for basic things like, where is this meeting? Can someone print off such and such a thing for me? The kind of like basic day-to-day stuff of any work role, and less about the detail of decision-making. It's also, to be frank, a lot of it is used for political gossip, right? So it's not just inside government. You see all of these groups of MPs who are sort of gossiping about different things or forming positions. And that's always going to be necessary. And before WhatsApp, that would have taken place by phone call or people just talking to each other face to face. So it's not something new, it's just a new format of that kind of conversation. There's plenty that it's good for, and we think that focus should remain. But where it's not good is for the detailed decision making. And so we think, it shouldn't be used for those kind of conversations. And if a discussion does look like it's moving towards that kind of conversation, then it should be for the senior people in that chat, in that group chat, to say, well, look, let's move this on to a different conversation. Let's have a meeting about this. Let's get on a proper video call or whatever it might be, so that we can talk this through properly, rather than just pinging these messages back and forth. So it's about being sensible, right? It's just a fact of life. There have been some people who said WhatsApp should be banned from government, and I don't think that's realistic. I don't think you can enforce that, and I don't think it'd be helpful, because it does bring benefits, but it's recognizing the limitations as well, and that there are better ways of doing things depending on what you're trying to achieve.
And that brings me really nicely onto my last question about the processes to determine which messages are kept, how they should be stored, and also how to ensure that critical messages aren't deleted or lost. Do you have any further insight on the process of that?
I mean, I think, it is always going to be down to the individual to sort of make those decisions. And that's the case for lots of bits of government information, right? So with the Freedom of Information Act, it's very difficult to sort of find evidence of this, but there have been people who say, well, it's kind of reduced the amount of stuff that is written down because people are worried about that stuff being released under an FOI request. And what WhatsApp has done has kind of converted what would have been, in many cases, spoken conversations into written material in a way that 20 years ago, people would have had those conversations on the phone or just face to face, and there would never have been a record of that. And so for people to sort of say, oh, we've got to release everything, we've got to see all of their WhatsApps, it's almost sort of slightly anachronistic in that that's not how it would have been had we not had this technology. So it's an interesting sort of new set of problems, I think. But what I think we do need to be doing is where it is detailed, where it is, where it's people sort of saying, I'm going to be late, or can you pick me up a sandwich or something like that. Obviously, that doesn't need to be kept for the historical record. What does need to be kept is when it's detailed discussions of policy, when it's kind of arguments about what the right thing to do is. And that's why we've said, where there are those kind of discussions, there should be civil servants in each of those groups, and their job should be to make sure that that conversation is kind of, literally you can just copy and paste the text, right, and put it into a Word document or an email and then save it on the proper systems so that it is there for the historical record. And then down the line, each government department has a team that's responsible for sort of information management and making sure that records are kept and get to where relevant to the National Archive for release. Is for that team to make those decisions about how much is released to the archives and so on, because they will be best placed to know whether or not this is sort of valuable. But what it shouldn't be is reliant on an individual to keep their personal phone and give that over to government when they're asked for it, because that's just it's not fair on the individual. And that's why, a lot of people were very critical of the inquiries asking for people's entire WhatsApp messages with each other, because one minister pointed out to me, some of these ministers, their kids go to the same schools, and so they're in parents groups, parents WhatsApp groups about their kids' schools, and that's obviously totally irrelevant to their role as government ministers, and that should be protected. So that's another reason why we think it makes sense for it to be, separate it out, have this on your government phone and keep your personal life on your personal phone, and then you can sort of safely not worry about that government phone because that's for the government machine to deal with rather than the individual.
Great. Well, that's all the discussion we have time for today. Thank you, Tim, for sharing your insights, and it's been really interesting to hear your perspective.